we get on to the interesting part of the talk, which is how we are images of God. And so we have to understand exactly how that might work. And I'm going to say images of God in every part, and that's where it gets particularly interesting, because when we look at each part, we can see images of God in the part as well as in the whole. And then we can learn a lot. We can come to some specific ideas about what creation is like and to be an image like that. And in particular, I'm going to show that there are levels in creation and sub-levels and sub-sub-levels. The Swedenborg normally calls these discrete degrees. So I'm going to explain about the possibility of sub-degrees, sub-sub-degrees, etc. And we'll see that quite a lot of detailed predictions follow from these principles of theism that we have here. And then at the end, I will look at questions of correspondences, what Swedenborg calls correspondences. I'm going to discuss the question of personal identity, how you identify a person over their lifetime, no matter how long it might be. And then there's the question of law and intervention, because some people think that natural law prevents anything from intervening or involving themselves from the outside. So we have to discuss exactly how we formulate natural law. We receive something like love and something like wisdom and something like action or power from God. And this means that there has to be separate containers, in some sense, separate containers for love, wisdom, and the means to action. So we receive life from God. That life is not us. We are always the recipients of life. This is the sort of something in a cup. This is the image, or blood in our vessels. That is an image of the way God's life lives within us. So we receive life, but we have to be able to store it and then use it. And the point is that these are then combined when we choose. And so we have to see what in us is the reception of love, what in us is the reception of wisdom, and what in us is the reception of means to action, and see if we can understand what those are from what we know already. And cooking, ingredients for cooking is an image of how this might work. We have three ingredients. We receive love, wisdom, and means to action, and we receive these ingredients, and then they act when we decide to act. And this reception in Swedenborg is also called influx. So influx of life or love, wisdom, power into us, and then we receive it. Influx is from the source, and it's reception on our point of view. But I said there are three kinds of things we receive from God, because everything receives something like love, something like wisdom, and something like power to action. So therefore, there's three kinds of reception. There's three parts of us that receive things. Now I'm going to say what I think these are. You'll probably recognize some of these, but I'm trying them in a framework which you may recognize. The first thing, as I call the spiritual body or the spiritual being of us is like a receptacle that receives loves in creation. Our desires, loves, affections, motivations, purposes, all of these things belong to love. And so there has to be something in us, in our body, mind, or soul, something there which receives spiritual things. So, as I said, power, anything that's a desire or love is an object, it's a substance which is in a certain form. That's as we talked in the second lecture. So there's the spiritual things which have to be received. There's the mental things which have to be received. The separate carriers of wisdom, including thoughts, ideas, understanding, rationality, plans, ideologies, beliefs. All of these things are mental, and they're all part of wisdom. If we're to be wise, we have to understand about rationality and how to understand things. We have to know what ideas are and be able to think with ideas, see other people's ideas. All of these things are parts of mental. I call them mental. And then finally, we receive the third thing from God, which is the power to action. And I call it the physical, to deal with the separate final actions and effects. And I say all the things we know from physics, all electric charges, magnetic charges, field theory, gravity, all of these things are physical things, and we have to receive something in us, namely our physical body, receives these things in some way. Now, I'll just mention at the end here that the first two, the spiritual and the mental, are both mind in some ways. Okay, so I'm bending the terminology a little bit, because normally we think of the spiritual as in the mind. But I'm going to use the spirit, mind, and body to refer to those three things. But I'm just saying there's another use of the word mind which refers to the first two together. So there are three things in us. There's a spiritual thing which receives love. There's a mental thing which receives understanding and ideas. And there's a physical thing which receives physical powers to act. And these have to be related together. And the way I'm going to relate them together is to use the ideas from last week when I talked about generative levels. You remember, a level above generates the one below, and the one below selects what is generated. And so God, and then the spiritual, and then the mental, and then the physical are four generative levels with three stages of generation between them. So God produces the spiritual, and the spiritual produces the mental, and the mental produces the physical. And so God generates the first spiritual realms where there are containing substances which appropriate and retain love, number one. The spiritual acts by producing new thoughts in the mental, and in the mental there are containing substances which appropriate and retain ideas. And the mental then acts in conjunction with the loves of the spiritual to produce new effects in the physical realm, and then the physical is the bottom line or the termination of the whole process. And so in other words, there's a cascading set of generative levels starting from God. God produces the spiritual, and the spiritual produces the mental, and the mental produces the physical. This is the way I'm trying to framework, and I want to see the relation between these things as these like generative levels that I talked about last week. So that previous slide talked about generation, but as well, there's a selection. The particular spiritual things select which loves from God can be received. So there's generation coming down, but there's selection which determines what is received that comes down. Because what comes down must be not only received, it has to be retained, and then it has to be used when the action occurs. And so there's a whole lot of constraints needed to make this whole system operate properly. The particular existing mental substances select which ideas can be further produced in the mind, and the particular physical things select which further physical things can be produced and have permanent physical effects. And so it's not a free-for-all to have God and spiritual and mental and physical, because there's relations going in both directions. They're not the same kind of relations. The generation from the top is different from the selection, but both of them are necessary. And the reason that there is generation is that God is life itself and has to produce and manage all of these things in the world. And the reason there is selection is that God wants the final effects to appear, the final delight to appear to be our delights. And so there's a reason for this dual structure, links coming down and selection coming up. So this is the sort of the basic structure that we have here. And now we come to the interesting part, at least from my point of view, because I want to say God is equally present in all subparts. God is the same everywhere, at all scales of space, and at all degrees, levels and stages of generation. So everything that exists, God appears as this threefold structure of love, wisdom, and power for action. So that means that the same pattern of the same threefold pattern can be applied to each of those three generative levels. The spiritual and the mental and the physical have sub-levels in themselves because each individually sort of is in the face of God, and God appears as that triple structure, this Trinitarian structure, as I put it. So this makes life a little bit complicated, a little bit interesting, because then these three levels that we talked about, spiritual, mental, and physical, have each of them three sub-levels. So there are 9 levels altogether, at least at this stage, and the Greek word for 9 is an ennead, a 9-fold set of levels. So across the top here in dark are the three things we had before. We have a spiritual degree, which has love. We have a mental degree of thoughts, and then a physical degree of actions in the body. But if each of those has a substructure, then you can talk about what the love is loving in the first degree. The love can be love of actions, or it can be love of thoughts, or love of love itself, or love of loving, I should say. Love itself is God. So there are sub-degrees in the spiritual degree or level. Similarly, the thoughts in the mind can be thoughts of different kinds of things. You can be thinking about actions. If you're a child or interested in doing things all the time, you might be thinking about actions, but not thinking about thoughts so much. Thinking about thoughts and thinking about logical structures and theories and everything is in the middle here, thought of thoughts. And then we hope, as we get older, we think more, not just about actions and thoughts, but we think about love. So that the growth of the mind from child to adult is to go up through these three middle stages. And on the right, we have sub-degrees in the physical. And I've just written them in a simple way here. So this slide is trying to show how you produce the sub-degrees of the three original degrees which are across the top. And shortly I'll show another way of thinking about these, which should be familiar to those that have read Swedenborg. But I want to remind you that each of these sub-degrees describes a substance of its own kind and a substance in its own space, because it has a capacity to interact with others of its own kind, as well as the generation and selection interactions. And within each of those spaces, so there are 9 spaces there, and there can be contact within 2 objects of the same kind. And each of the 9 spaces exists simultaneously and can interpenetrate without collision. So,
Kind go up and down, or
well,
when you say 2?
I think of it as going down here, and then down there, and down there. But there are links across the top. Well, it gets interesting. I mean, I haven't explained in detail the relations between all of these 9 levels, because... So this slide is the ennead, the 9-fold set of sublevels, and I've said form. In other words, this is the logical structure of these 9 levels. But the next slide gives us content for these 9 levels in what might be more familiar terms. And as I said, the middle 3 levels are like children. A new baby starts off with an exterior mind, and as they get to about 12 or whatever, teenagers, they're interested in more rational and scientific activities. And then as you become more interested in understanding yourselves and understanding religion, you become more interested in an anterior rational view of things, in which you focus on the particular loves that you have and not just on the thoughts that you have. So these three middle ones are interior rational, scientific rational, and exterior mind. These are names that I've adapted from Swedenborg. Swedenborg, and on the left here we have, I take these to be referred to the heavens that Swedenborg talks about. So if you have a love of actions, that's what Swedenborg calls the spiritual natural heaven. This is where people are interested in having a conscience and want to do the right thing all the time. This is, because Swedenborg talks about three heavens. And it's clear that there are people who want to do the right thing, they want to be helpful and do things, but they don't understand a great deal about the reasons for doing things. So then you next go to the next level, spiritual heaven, which is a deep understanding about the way people think. It's a love of thought. So in the spiritual heaven, people think about wisdom and they want to understand all the details as much as possible. But at the top, here we have what Swedenborg calls the celestial heaven, which is the love of loving. So at this point, they don't think so much as they act from affection in a more spontaneous way. So I think this threefold structure gives us an important overview of what creation is like. And on the right here, we have actual physical processes. And so I'm going to, on the slide after this, I'm going to expand this rightmost column some more, just to show that it can be done, because I said everything that there is, God appears to it in a threefold way, so that each of these sub-levels can have sub-levels, unfortunately, or fortunately. So the next, what have I done here? Yes, so it's a little bit difficult to read, but here's the three columns. This is the first column of the spiritual, and the physical world is this big box that's been expanded on the right-hand side there. And the bottom three here of energy, wave function, and actual selection was my example from quantum mechanics that I talked about last week. And then these three here, the next one, variational principles, field laws, and virtual events. These are the level above another three that I mentioned. I showed briefly on the last slide of last week's talk, but I didn't explain in great detail. But what's interesting is that it points to this new degree, which is to do with the reception or the effects of love in there, which I think is related to gravity, how space-time is produced. But there's room for a lot of speculation in this, and currently physicists are very interested in how gravity is produced, what quantum gravity might look like. And I believe that these people are in effect searching for how to identify the processes that go on in this subdegree and its sub-subdegrees. And so, yes. So this 3-3, this is the actual processes of quantum mechanics, then virtual processes, and some speculative discussion of pre-geometric processes that produce space-time. So what I'm saying here is that these principles of theism that I talked about seemed very simple to start with, but once you allow the fact that everything is an image of God in the whole and in each part, then you can generate a complicated structure, well, apparently complicated structure of the world that has, as you burrow into each part, it has more details. It's like a fractal. You know, fractals, you go into each subsection and then you expand it and you discover a lot more detail, individual character of detail in each small section. And I think I can identify, using ideas from Swedenborg about the heavens, using ideas from developmental psychology to discuss the growth of the mind. And Piaget and Erikson talk about some sub-degrees in the mind, which I might talk about next week. Okay, so that's the end of the sort of digging, the burrowing down, the digging deeper into each of these degrees and sub-degrees. And I thought I'd end with just a few general slides to explain some overall features of this way of seeing things. And what I want to emphasize is that each of these levels, sub-levels and sub-sub-levels is a substance, it has a substance. Actually, more precisely, it is a substance and has a form. I should have put it that way. Everything is substance or form, physical, mental, spiritual things. And I have this little slogan to myself, no process without structure, no structure without substance. Because a lot of people have ideas that don't agree with that. And then furthermore, I want to say the time is normal, okay? It's not some people may have read from Swedenborg that there is not time in the spiritual world, but people can misunderstand that. There are still changes, still successive changes, and in particular, the past is definite, the future doesn't yet exist, maybe as a form, and the present is the sort of the middle between them, the conscious point of becoming. And I think many people will recognize that as a sort of a normal way of looking at time, and that, I claim, can be applied to spirituality. Now, I'll just mention that maybe God knows the forms for future things. I mean, this is what omniscience of God is, but he doesn't know their substance. He knows their form, but not their substance, because future substances don't exist. Future substances are still being formed from the being of God. And then I'll talk about correspondences. That's a little bit more detailed, maybe, than I want to go to. I mentioned it briefly last time, but when you have a series of events at one level and a series of events in another, because there are generative links and coming down and there are selection links, selection acts going up, in order for some pattern to persist for a long time, we have an alternation of generation and selection which will last the longest, will repeat itself the longest if the patterns of the two levels are most similar. Similar in the sense that they continually produce selection and generation in the right way. So that means that we think of the sun, for instance, corresponds to love, or love corresponds to energy. So energy behaves in the similar way to what love behaves. And Swedenborg discusses a lot of these correspondences. And as I said here, this gives rise to correspondences of function. So what I've done is to try and give a causal explanation of why there are correspondences and not just take them for granted. And Swedenborg describes a lot more of these correspondences. But he doesn't so often describe why the particular correspondences exist. But now I've taken on the challenge with this kind of explanation of explaining why lungs correspond to wisdom, or heart corresponds to love, or eyes correspond to understanding. There's the question of personal identity. How you identify a person over a long period, including if they survive after bodily death. And because love is the substance of a person, you cannot change a person without changing their loves. Okay, so that means that people resist having their loves changed. This is a general feature. You know, it's everything that I stand for, everything that I want is what people identify themselves with their loves. They sometimes may be mistaken, but in general, if they know what they want, then they're much more happy with themselves. And so the continuity of a particular love coincides with the continuity of a person. And that means that it's difficult to change loves. I mean, this is what spiritual regeneration is about. It's about how to grow one's loves and to do things in different ways. But it's difficult to change loves and keep the same person without the old loves sort of wanting and adopting the new ones. It's a tricky process. And that's why one of the reasons why spiritual growth is so difficult. You remember from last week when I had these generative levels, the top one was fixed. And this applies here. The deepest love can be unchanging. And the deepest love of a person can be used to permanently identify that person. This is the way Swedenborg says you can identify people in the spiritual world, because they have the same characteristic loves. And Swedenborg also discusses what he calls the inmost degree. Occasionally he mentions an inmost degree, but it's not normally seen, but it's seen by God as something permanent which identifies and is unique for each person. So I don't know very much about that. I'll talk about law and intervention, because some people think that the physical universe has fixed laws, and then these laws describe the behavior of physical things. But I say the physical laws describe the behavior of physical things only if there's no influx from the spiritual or mental. Because if there's only physical laws, then matter is what we call causally closed. But in theism, we don't have this causal closure. The world is always being receiving life from God. And so we always have influx, or matter is always receiving power from somewhere. And in fact, if you look into modern explanations of quantum gravity, they continue to see quantum gravity as some kind of dynamical process which generates space and time and generates the coupling constants of the universe. And so therefore, I think physics is also moving towards this view, because from the theistic point of view, we need this influx in order to sustain physical processes, but also to select and contain all of the mental and spiritual things that have generated it. So because the structure that I've been describing has links going up as well as down, all levels are needed. So from Swedenborg's point of view, you need to live your life on Earth in order to form some physical actions in order to have a permanent life even after you die. This is one of the things that Swedenborg emphasizes, that not many other philosophies make clear why that should occur. Most people recognize that it does occur, but they don't see why. And so when you have influx into the physical, this is not intervention, but it's what's intended. It's the intended causal influx. And I say, we note how sustained mental and spiritual processes depend on physical selections. And so therefore, life on Earth is necessary. You can't just create beings without having lived in the physical, which requires a particular view of what angels are, for example. In other words, the physical is the needed bottom line for creation.